Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Hugh Hewitt live in Studio North, joined by Congressman Mike Gallagher, chairman of the House Select Committee on the engagement with the Chinese Communist Party. Good morning, Congressman. No Browns jokes this morning. We're in mourning over in Cleveland over Nick Chubb, but let's get right to the consequences of the digging into the fight, Wall Street ties with China. What happened this week?
Well, this week we are continuing our investigation into MSCI and BlackRock, as well as teasing out the implications of the war game that we conducted last week in New York. And then in the House and in the Senate, we're debating this really important question of what restrictions should we place on outbound capital flows to China. There's slightly different provisions in the House and Senate right now. Senators Cornyn and Casey have a provision that would require transparency and reporting for investments in certain sectors in China. In the House, the Financial Services Committee just approved Andy Barr's bill. Andy Barr is also a member of my select committee on the CCP, which would impose sanctions, very aggressive sanctions, on the worst actors in China, companies like Huawei and AVIC, OFAC sanctions, very, very intense sanctions. I think these two approaches are actually complementary. They are not in competition. And I think it gives us an opportunity as the National Defense Authorization Act moves forward and as we conference it with the Senate to actually do meaningful legislation that will prevent Americans, prevent asset managers, prevent retirees from unwittingly or wittingly funding the Chinese Communist Party's massive military expansion and thereby subsidizing our own destruction in the process.
Congressman, you mentioned Andy Barr. He's the good Andy. Andy Biggs is the anti-military Andy. Andy Biggs and Matt Rosendale and Dan Bishop and Ralph Norman and one other knucklehead, I can't remember, voted against the rule that would have funded the Department of Defense. You're very serious about defense like Michael Wall. Have you taken them aside to say this is just a nightmare to operate DOD on a continuing resolution?
Well, we're certainly, we had a very long conference meeting yesterday in which we tried to make the case. And, the other problem is it just puts us at such a disadvantage relative to the Senate, where the Democrats are in control and, of course, naturally favor non-defense spending priorities over defense spending priorities. So if we Republicans can't band together and pass what is fundamentally a conservative but smart defense bill, and it had a lot of policy riders we want, getting rid of woke programs in the Pentagon, tackling some other reform issues. If we can't band together and pass that out of the House, it puts us at a massive disadvantage in terms of our ability to negotiate with the Senate. And with a narrow majority, we have a very narrow majority in the House. Obviously, nobody's going to get 100% of what they want. For example, I wanted more money for multi-year appropriations for key missile systems that are relevant in order to prevent a PLA invasion of Taiwan. But that's something that we still need to work on. But the bottom line is, if we can't pass that, we effectively hand the leverage to Chuck Schumer. And we know that the bill that Chuck Schumer is going to craft is going to be far worse for conservative priorities than the bill that we've crafted in the House. So Speaker McCarthy, I think, made the right decision to keep us here over the weekend. I'm hoping that particularly if some members who were absent for various reasons are able to come back to D.C., perhaps the math will change and that we can keep voting until we pass something. But we got to send something over to the Senate. Otherwise, we're gonna be forced to consider something that is far less conservative in the days to come.
Now, I know you will not speak for Congressman Norman or Matt Rosendale or Dan Bishop or the other two in the Knucklehead Caucus or the larger group of 15 who are screwing around with the entire budget process. I know you won't speak for them, but what do you think they need to focus on? Because I don't understand the interplay between the appropriations and the NDAA, and maybe if I did, they would.
Well, really, I would at this point think of them as separate processes. The appropriation and the budget process is what's coming to a head this week and next week, whereas NDAA will play out over the next couple of months. The National Defense Authorization Act basically, establishes what DoD is allowed to do. It's sort of like the policy bill, whereas the appropriations bill just give the money for those various policy priorities, but they're not linked in the process right now. We are, in the most immediate sense, considering the appropriations bills. As for what the various holdouts need, I actually think there was some productive discussions yesterday between Representative Norman and leadership. It was a discussion about the overall spending levels that would be in our bills. And so I think there was some positive progress made on that. And so I'm hoping, when next time we have something up for a vote today, the math changes a little bit. As for the other holdouts, I don't know. Obviously, some of them just fundamentally oppose Speaker McCarthy's position as Speaker, and I think want to provoke a fight over his speakership. So I'm actually not sure that there's any policy change or concession that could placate them and convince them to vote for a continuing resolution or an appropriations bills. I actually think it's about the broader speaker fight right now, in which case I'm just not sure how you get any of those members to yes. So that's the bad news, Hugh. But the good news, I don't think not everyone is that's a holdout right now is in that camp.
Let me ask you about, I don't know what happens when you have the legislative equivalent of a suicide bomber in your caucus. But if they blow that up and bring in a motion to vacate, does the speaker lose his job and we end up with Speaker Hakeem Jeffries?
Well, you don't end up with Speaker Hakeem Jeffries because you basically, as I understand it, go back to where we were in January of this year, where you're having a vote on the speakership, and to become speaker, you would still need to get a majority in the House, and presumably, unless those members who wanted to remove McCarthy suddenly voted for Hakeem Jeffries wouldn't have enough votes to become speaker. So we would be speaker-less in the House. And we would still have to have this budget battle with the Senate. And if you remember, we spent about 2 weeks trying to get enough votes to make Kevin McCarthy speaker. So it would take us back in time to where we were in January. We would lose all our momentum. And I would say this, obviously in divided government, we are going to struggle to advance and instantiate into law all of the conservative policy priorities that we want, right? Because the Senate is not going to go along with it. The president is going to veto a lot of it. And I understand the need to drive a hard bargain. And I do think we should use our majority, narrow though it is, to drive a hard bargain. But think about the massive impact that we have been able to have with control of the House in terms of basic oversight. Think of the massive impact that Comer has been able to have with his gavel on the Oversight Committee and all of the things that have come to light with respect to Hunter Biden and the corruption of the Biden family. I would submit our committee has been able to conduct effective oversight when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and its corruption of various domestic institutions. All of that goes away if we go back to the chaos of January. All that momentum we have in terms of our investigation, in terms of our oversight, in terms of the pressure that we're putting on the Biden administration and our attempts to hold the Biden administration accountable, go away if we are suddenly thrust into a speaker fight and wasting weeks and weeks of time we don't have to do endless votes on a new speaker. And so I just don't understand the end game here. And I actually think it undermines our conservative majority and the conservative priorities that we want to advance in this Congress.
They are children. They will take the media narrative back to January. Republicans can't govern, and it will stick through next November. This is just a political analysis, not a substantive analysis. Everything you said about the reality of oversight is real and happened, and everyone can count it. But if children are on the ground kicking their heels, there's nothing to be done unless you get a working majority with the Democrats. I don't know, shared power on the committee, something like that. There have got to be 10 Democrats who care about defense spending, isn't there?
There are, but think about that, right? So if McCarthy was then forced to go to, let's say, the Democrats on the Problem Solvers Caucus, Josh Gottheimer and folks like that, who are reasonable. Well, of course, the deal he has to cut with them would be worse from a conservative perspective than if we were just able to stick together as a conservative caucus. So again, it's counterproductive to our overall priorities. And I think the Democrats would demand a very high price in that scenario. So I don't know, Hugh. We'll see what happens over the next 48 hours. We're going to keep voting on this stuff. And, I would say leadership is working in good faith with some members that didn't vote for the defense bill or the continuing resolution or have not yet indicated they support the continuing resolution. And so let's hope those negotiations continue and end up somewhat productive over the next 48 hours.
Good luck with that, Chairman, because my belief is Beijing is laughing at us, and they are telling everyone up and down the Central Committee, look what happens when you turn away from authoritarianism and dictatorship. You end up with nothing. That's what these five knuckleheads are doing. Chairman Mike Gallagher of the China Select Committee, I appreciate your joining me.